Hey, I'm DJ Sixsmith. You're watching The Sit Down. Gianna Toboni is here with us. Vice on Showtime, excellent program. Deep diving into COVID-19. Gianna, how are you?
Hey, DJ, thanks for having me. I'm doing well.
You got it. So why don't we peel back the layers here? Just take me through how you and the team got this assignment here. And obviously COVID has taken over our lives, but very few people have seen the inside of a hospital and talked to people really impacted by this. So how did it all come together?
I was talking to my brother and sister-in-law who are both doctors in St. Louis, Missouri, and kind of monitoring the COVID-19 coverage. And I just felt like there wasn't enough of a sort of deep dive on healthcare workers. We had seen some sound bites here and there from frontlines doctors and nurses, but I really wanted to understand, what these folks were dealing with, both, in their personal lives and professional lives, dealing with this unprecedented pandemic. And so the approach that we took and the story that I pitched was to really focus on one healthcare worker who's on the front lines. And that's what we did. We found this incredible doctor. His name's Dr. Al-Obaidi. He and his wife were both medical doctors in Iraq during the war. Their family had been kidnapped. He had been kidnapped a second time. So he had dealt with a lot of things. And my big question was, are you desensitized to this? And surprisingly, he isn't. He feels such compassion for these families and patients. He feels such sadness when he loses patients. His family has really intense fears about him contracting the virus. His son, who was just a child when they were in Iraq, had these memories of growing up there, seeing armed men shooting up shops next to his dad's. And you could tell that trauma sort of returned when he thought about the potential of his dad getting this virus and maybe losing one of his parents. And his wife, the same thing. She at the start felt very, strong and tough as she is. But as we continued to talk, you realize that this is emotionally extremely difficult, watching your spouse, your best friend go into this basically war zone every day. And they thought that comparison was appropriate.
Was there a point for them where it was just really awful when it really started to sink in that this is much bigger than a lot of people had anticipated?
Yeah, it was actually, when I asked about the comparison to war, I basically said, is that appropriate? You're well suited to answer that question. And they both, to my surprise, thought that COVID-19 was actually in some ways worse than the war in Iraq. And the reason was that they said we were dealing with this in a very localized way, and they saw horrific stuff. He was telling us he saw friends being killed in front of him. With COVID-19, this is a global problem, right? And so they said, we actually can't even wrap our heads around what we're dealing right now. And it is worse. Right as we started filming with the family and with Dr. Al-Obaidi, he started to experience extreme shortness of breath. And he's not somebody who is hyperbolic in any way. If anything, he wouldn't tell us about this, right? And he said it was something he had never experienced in his life. And basically the symptoms came on. And you could tell that his family was nervous about it. And then we went to the hospital with him and we're filming in the hospital with him, and he gets a call. And I guess we'll sort of blow it here, but the test comes back negative. And so I said, so what do you think it was, And he said, I think I actually did have the virus, but I think my body cleared it. The rate of false negatives for the test that I took is 33%. So imagine that, right? It's 1 in 3 people get a negative when they're actually positive. And that's one of the things with this virus, it's just still undiscovered. The testing isn't there, antibody testing for the virus. And so we really don't know, when we look at this data and all these numbers, what does this actually mean? I think that we are only scratching the surface when it comes to data and research about the virus.
I had a friend who had the virus for a month and he had no idea, and he's an essential worker, and he was out there continuing his job, and finally he took the antibody test and he found out. But imagine being right there in the hospital and not knowing every single day. It's really shocking and really scary, and you were actually in the hospital. So what was most eye-opening about that experience, just taking cameras in there and talking to people?
So I think it's interesting that you say that, because I actually wasn't in the hospital. I have a newborn baby, and it would have been near impossible to quarantine from him for those 2 weeks. We had a great team in the hospital led by Jackie Jesko, our producer, and we had a camera op and producer camera op, and they went in, and the most shocking thing to them initially was how young the patients were, who were on the COVID floor, including ones who were on ventilators. So they were seeing patients in their 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s. And that's one of the things that surprised Dr. Alabaidi too. And that's one of those things that came out of China that we thought, oh, this is a virus we should be very concerned about, mostly for the elderly population. And that just hasn't, proven true in our country. And so I think that was the most surprising thing for the team. And very sadly, a few days before we were in the hospital, Dr. Alabaidi had a patient who was only 27 years old. He had no underlying conditions, otherwise healthy young man, and he died. He died the Friday before we got there. And talking to his family and his girlfriend, you just realize this virus can really get anybody. And I think that's a good reminder to people, as we start to see the curve flattening, it's really not time to go outside. It's not time to socialize. Like, we are just not there yet.
And you're somebody who's been all around the world too. I mean, this is right at our front doors here in America, but all across the world. I mean, there's some areas that don't have the infrastructure and are not prepared for this. Have you taken the time to really think about just how much this is going to impact the globe and what your next traveling situation will look like once this all clears out?
Yeah, I keep thinking about India, actually. I mean, we think New York City is dense, and certainly is part of the reason I think that the numbers are so much higher in that city. But when you're talking about other places like India, and yeah, I mean, they are going to be dealing with, I think, I'm thinking about certain countries in Africa too. They don't have the infrastructure. We're talking about not having enough PPE and ventilators. I'm concerned about places that are way under-resourced than we are. When it comes to our jobs, it's been a really interesting challenge to try to put a film together without really going into the field. Like, we have a preliminary, policy that is, we're grounding all flights at this point, with some exceptions. And so now, as we look forward to the next few months, what does that look like for us? How do we continue telling these stories overseas? And our teams have been super creative in how we can do it, finding local crews, shooting interviews, remote, but not just on Zoom. Like, can we put a couple cameras on either side and make it look like it's a little more intimate and actually be in both places at the same time? So I don't know. I think that we, in coming months, will be seeing a lot of security clearances at airports. I have no idea what it's going to look like, but I'm crossing my fingers that we're able to find a way to travel safely, and to continue making films. Because one of the things that we do, and part of the reason we all work for Vice, is that we actually get to go to the places and we get to meet the people and see up close what they're dealing with day to day. And so I hope that we can continue doing that, but safety first. I mean, the worst case scenario, and which is why we're not giving this any breathing room, is to show up in a place like Syria and bring the virus there. We're just not taking those chances.
One of the things you mentioned with this story is just talking to people, hearing how they're feeling about everything. Was there something else that you focused on that you hadn't really thought about with COVID-19? Because it's one thing to think about the human side of it, but was there anything else that really opened your eyes to something you hadn't thought about as much?
I did a story on the medical transitions of transgender children a few years ago. And one of the things that was most fascinating to me about that story is that this area of research was still very undiscovered. Like, doctors were saying to us, we are, encouraging these families to allow their children to transition, and we're giving them hormone blockers because we think that's what's best for them, but we don't know. And the reason I think this story is very interesting to me as well is because it is so undiscovered. I feel like every week there's data that's being shot down that was, being held up as the best data we have. And so I'm interested to see, as we continue seeing like new tests come out, like this antibody test. I was thinking about getting it, and then I thought, is it even worth it if we don't know whether you can get reinfected? Like, does this immunity hold or not? So I would say that the most interesting part for me is how undiscovered this virus is.
Yeah, we still need a lot of answers there. And, it's one thing for me to navigate this. It's another thing for you with a newborn to navigate this situation. How has life been for you? And, what are some interesting things that have popped up given everything going on right now?
Yeah, I'm very grateful that this virus hasn't been as severe with babies and children, although there have been exceptions which have been pretty devastating. But the working from home has certainly been a challenge with a little one. My colleagues and I have these debates over what's harder, like toddlers or babies who can't crawl yet. It's like the babies depend on you 24/7, but the toddlers can move around. So that's been an interesting challenge. And I'd say that while it is hard day to day being, on back-to-back calls and interviews, um, I'm also very grateful to have this time with my little one and my husband and family. And because we are seeing so much hard, bad, devastating news every single day, I think it is important to find the silver linings here. And so that I've been trying to do that in my personal life.
I think that's really good perspective. You're somebody who has devoted your life to powerful storytelling. You've been all over the world. Where does this one rank in terms of all the stuff you've done in your career?
I would say this one is just unprecedented. Like anytime I'm thinking about this story, I don't think we can even grasp what this will mean for our country, for our world. And I don't know that I've ever taken on a story where I can't see the end of it. And this is one where I think for months, for years, we'll be talking about this. I got a text the other day that was, saying that my baby is going to be reading about this in the history books. And it's hard to really even feel the gravity of it. It's hard to wrap your head around what this story is, and that's the first time I've really experienced that in my career.
John, thanks so much for jumping on. Looking forward to having people check it out, and best of luck with everything going forward. Stay safe, all right?
Thanks so much, DJ.